co-organized by the Global Alliance for Tax Justice together with a number of other organizations, Queen's University, Canada, as well as Public Services International, Tax Justice Network, Action Aid, Christian Aid, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, Womankind, Bretton Woods Project, and DAWN. That's Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. Now, some few housekeeping before we get to start. One is that the session is going to be live streamed on our Facebook page, and we are also going to be taking some photos. If the internet does not allow us to live stream, we'll take a video. So if you don't give us your consent, kindly approach my colleague Ella here and inform her of that, all right? So that's one. Number two, I have some buttons here. The Global Alliance is currently running a campaign on tax justice for women's rights around the world. So we have coordinated actions being carried out. The campaign was launched on the 8th of March, and it's gonna run up to the end of the Commission of the Status of Women, the CSW, on the 22nd. So if you can be tweeting us, we have a number of hashtags. There's a hashtag tax justice, then there's hashtag women's rights. I also have buttons here. Like you can see, I have one I'm putting on, it's black. It's written, "Make taxes work for women." That's the theme for the campaign, because we want to see taxes making a difference in the lives of women around the world. And so I'll pass it along. You can pick one and pin it on your blouse or your clothing. I think, okay, everybody in the front row has. So just pick one and pass around. We have a very big panel, as you can see. So the format for today, for the session, we are going to give each panelist 7 minutes to present, to share with us what they have. And then I know at the end of their presentations, we'll at least have around 30 minutes for a Q&A. And if you have comments also, please do share with us. So, just to introduce the session, and so that you know what we are talking about, the session is titled "Taxing for Gender Equality, Evaluating Gender and Intersectional Effects of Tax Laws." So we are hoping to get different reflections from different parts of the world, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, from Europe, from North America, the US, Canada, you know. So we'll get to hear reflections on this, but also we are going to look at how policies advanced by regional and international tax policy and governance bodies have been able to undermine women's progress towards economic autonomy and equality. And we are going to get examples from all countries at all levels of development, as I've said, and with an emphasis on countries in which tax laws increase barriers to gender, the basic necessities of life, and income equality, as well as national, regional, and global initiatives to ensure that all tax systems promote gender and intersectional equalities and the sustainability of human lives. So thank you and welcome. So the first presenter, I know this is not usually the case, is going to be me. So I'll be the first one to start off the conversation. I'm going to be very brief so that I can give the rest enough time to also share with us what they have. So for me, I'm giving you reflections from an African perspective with examples from Africa. And basically, as a background, is that in terms of literature on tax and gender from Africa, this is usually unavailable for the better part, and increasingly in the recent past we've seen a lot of research coming up, and we are starting to get literature on issues tax and gender, but more still needs to be done. We need to generate more information around these issues from an African perspective. So tax policies can affect men and women differently because of the different roles that they play in society, and also because of their different consumer behaviors. And it can be both explicit and implicit in a way that, on one hand, how much of taxes is raised to fund public services, social protections and infrastructure, and on the other hand, on how much of it is raised. So when you're looking at how much of taxes is raised, what are the tax leakages that really makes governments to be deprived of the much needed resources to fund public services? And also in terms of how it is raised, so what are these tax policies or tax systems that undermine women's economic empowerment, and also make women to really not achieve and realize their women's rights. So in the case of Kenya, I'm going to look at the income tax and its evolution since independence. So in the 1960s and in the 70s, women's income was lumped together with that of their husbands for tax purposes. Income of a married woman was deemed to be that of the husband for the purpose of determining his total annual taxable income. However, in the 80s, the wife's employment income was separated from the husband's income for tax purposes. So you see, in this instance, that was addressed. Currently, the wife and husband are treated separately for tax purposes. However, there's still the option of joint filing of taxes. But something that really stands out, when you look at the language in the tax return forms, it assumes that the main taxpayer is still a male. So you will not find an option of wife or female, but the language that is there is male. So all these other intersections of gender is not really captured. And also in the 60s and 70s in Kenya, exemptions and relief varied according to the marital status of the individual. So whether you are married, single, or special single to be single with children, and also that of your age. And only married men were treated as married, while married women were in the category of singles. Okay? These were all unified in the 90s, and the discriminatory elements were eliminated. Also, another example of discrimination was that allowances varied by number of children, and this was only given to men, again, but this has been addressed, and this element of discrimination removed. So that's an example of the Kenyan context. When you move to South Africa, during the apartheid years, the tax system was discriminatory through the tax schedule definitions and application of the primary rebate and retirement annuities, contributions and deductions. But from March 95, a single tax structure was imposed on all individuals, irrespective of your gender or marital status. But a single primary rebate for those under 65 was introduced, and the differences in retirement annuity deductions were removed, and for dependents were also removed. These provisions put an end to formal explicit gender discrimination in the tax system. However, if I give you an example, a hypothetical example, consider one household consisting of a husband, wife, and 2 children, and the husband earns 2,000 rands per month, and the wife earns 1,000 rand per month. Household number 2 consists of an employed woman who earns 3,000 rand. So both families have the same amount of income, right? But this household number 2, the woman lives with her non-earning mother and her 2 children. So she's a single parent. So during the earlier tax regime, it attempted to put these 2 households in more or less equal positions, given their seemingly equal needs, but with some reduction in tax for the married couple so as not to discourage women's employment. After removal of discrimination on the basis of gender and marital status, as I said before, and using the tax tables of the 2099, the first household would pay 850 rand, while the second household would pay 4 times much more, at 3,460. Why? It appears that formal discrimination on the basis of gender and marital status has been replaced with a more severe indirect discrimination against some of those who do not conform to having a nuclear family model. And I think the topic of family is also a big issue at the CSW in terms of definition and how we look at the family, but I'll not go into that right now. When you go to Nigeria, their tax system also seems to suggest that the system is unfair to the female gender. For instance, when you look at their Income Tax Act, it explicitly discriminates against married women with respect to tax reliefs and allowances by making the husband the sole claimant of children's allowances at the expense of the wife, even if they are both employed in the same profession or company. This is based on the assumption that men are breadwinners in the family, and this singular act unjustly denies women who are actually the breadwinners of their family equal access to tax relief for their children. So in conclusion, we can see that most of the explicit biases have been removed through tax reforms. However, implicit biases still exist in some tax systems. So there's a need for detailed analysis of tax systems to identify these biases and to propose the relevant recommendations. And on that note, I'll hand over to the next speaker to share with us their discussion on this topic. So the next speaker is Corina. Corina Rodriguez is the executive, she's an executive committee member of the Development Alternatives with Women for New Era, and she's also a lecturer in the universities in Argentina. She's based in Buenos Aires. So.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to bring the Latin American perspective to this conversation. We know that taxation is key for equality, so taxation should be key in Latin America, that still remains as the more unequal region in the world. To give you a sense of this, the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality that goes from 0 to 1, 1 is total unequal. In Latin America, the level of this index is 0.47 in average. But since we are quite a heterogeneous region, here we have countries like Uruguay with a Gini index below 0.4, and Guatemala with a Gini index close to 0.6. And almost 40% of workers in Latin America earn less than the minimum wage, 35% among men and 50% among women. So there is high poverty, there is high inequality, and the high level of inequality is persistent even after a long decade of expanding social expenditure and extension of social protection coverage in the region, mostly through cash transfers. So clearly trying to redistribute through public expenditure is not enough, and taxation is a big part of the explanation. And to this concern about persistent inequality in Latin America, now we have to add the concern given the current shift in the political and economic context and a significant pushback. There is a shift to right-wing governments, conservative governments that are explicitly challenges women's rights. A friend from Brazil in a panel the other day, she's here also today, was saying that the Brazilian women's minister said that gender is not in her agenda, for you to have a sense of how strong the pushback is. And there is also a shift in the macroeconomic policy, with a return to austerity and privatization trends. So in this context, how does the tax system work in Latin America? With differences among countries and despite some improvements in the last decade, the main features of the tax systems in Latin America are a pretty low tax burden. In average, it's 18% of the GDP. Regressive tax structure, because there is much reliance on indirect taxation, mostly on VAT. 60% of total taxes are indirect taxes. And there is a very low taxation on income, including on corporate income, and extremely low taxation on wealth and inheritance. And of course, we face, as every country, every region in the South, the challenge of illicit financial flows. And why this is bad for equality, we are more or less clear about that, and how this is also bad for gender equality. In Latin America, as in Africa, we are already having some research, although we still need much more. But as far as I know, there have been analyses for at least the cases of Argentina, Bolivia, Mexico, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Honduras, República Dominicana. And while there are differences among the countries, there are some common findings, and these are the following. In Latin America, there is almost non-explicit gender bias in tax codes, which is good, since tax codes in the region seems to obey the non-discrimination principle. However, there are implicit biases, gender implicit biases, that results mostly from the combination of the shape of the tax system as well as the prevailing gender inequalities. And I will highlight three of these implicit biases. One is the bias that comes from the different treatment given to personal income depending on the source of the income. In some countries, the tax burden for wage earners is lower than that for self-employed. And since there is a gender gap between participation in wage employment and in self-employment, there is also a gender bias because women are overrepresented among self-employed workers in Latin America. The other big source of implicit bias in taxation is the regressive profile of tax systems. There have been some quantitative incidence analysis that prove that women are more affected by regressivity due to the intersection between socioeconomic and gender inequality. And most of the quantitative research done show that female-headed households are the most vulnerable to this impact. And they are facing more heavily the burden of this regressive type of taxes. And finally, we have a link between taxation and gender inequality that refers to the existence in the region of a large tax exemptions. So that takes us to the problem of the race to the bottom in tax standards. Governments trying to attack foreign investment, so offering many tax benefits to transnational corporations, and this takes resources out from government, reducing their capacity to implement public policies for gender equality. And besides the states being unable to finance gender equality policies, these tax benefits for corporations do not produce any gain for women, because there is no more employment for women, no higher wages, no better access to social services, no better access to social protection. And of course, we have the whole big problem of illicit financial flows that go beyond beyond this. So since my time is running out, probably I will finish by bringing you some three very short examples about how we can face this and what can be done. One example is from my country. We have a VAT, which is very extended to most goods and services, including basic goods. But the government decided to implement a reduction in the VAT rate only for cash transfers beneficiaries. So when beneficiaries of cash transfers buy some basic goods, they get a reduction in the VAT they pay. But for this, they have to pay with their bank card. So the take-up of this policy is a bit low because much of the places where these people buy have not the possibility of paying with the bank card. And just to finish, in Colombia, I think that the other very important issue is for women and feminist organizations to be trained on fiscal issues and to bring these issues to their own agenda. And one example, and I will finish with that, in Colombia, they went through a big tax reform in 2018. The tax reform was not great, was not very progressive, but in the middle of that, women's organizations get a reduction on the VAT rate for tampons and other feminine hygiene products because they held a big campaign for this. So it's only a very small example on how when we got informed about the issue and we got organized, we can push for at least these small steps of the bigger change that we are all for, that is to have much more progressive taxation in our countries.
Thank you, Marina. So we've had reflections from Africa and Latin America, and we have seen some of the features that are coming up and some that are cutting across. On that note, I want to invite Tui to also share with us. She's going to give us her perspective from the Asia region. She's the policy and campaign manager at ActionAid Vietnam. And so her example is majorly going to be from the Vietnamese context. So,
thank you very much. So I would like to give you the background from the taxation in Asia regions. Actually, tax competition is one of the issues that we are having. For example, like in 1998, the corporate income tax for Vietnam is like 32%, and other countries also like Thailand and Myanmar is also 35%. But recently, we also have like some research, and then we found out that like Vietnam and Thailand now to reduce the corporate income tax. That will affect to the public services. But however, we have a lot of free trade agreements. It means that tariff will happen, and it means that we can have like less tax income, and then it will affect to the revenue of the country. For example, like Vietnam, we signed the Vietnam-EU FTA and also were a member from CPTPP. It means that, and others like ASEAN and EU and many other like free trade agreements. It means that we are in the blanket of like tax tariff. So from that, the budget for public services, especially for women, were reduced. However, for the VAT tax, the government also tried to increase, and it will affect to the women especially. Why? Because actually from our research, we can find out that like women have to work 5 hours per day for unpaid care work. From our research from ActionAid in Vietnam. And from that, there are some reasons that some women in some area, they have to work even to 7 hours. Why? Because of public services, they have to spend more time to catch water because they live in the mountainous area. So it means that if we can have more budget for public services, so the woman can reduce the unpaid care work. And when we have a lot of free trade agreement, a lot of women have to migrate from the rural area to the urban area to work in the urban area. But however, public services like access to school or kindergartens or health services is limited. So government should like invest more for public services because the woman will be affected, because many women have to stay at home to take care for the baby. Because for the free trade agreement, they only recruit women from 18 to like 35 years old. And it means that they have to stay at home to do the unpaid care work. And from that, it will affect to the pension for the futures when women have to work for unpaid care work. So that will affect a lot. So, and besides that, we also have the double tax duty also. For the double tax duties, it will affect to the poor countries. Because for example, like Amazon, they have the office in Vietnam and Asia country. But the income online from UK, they go to that country. So how, where that money come from? And how we can get money to pay for the public services? And women will have effect more than others like people. So it means that we need to advocate government to allocate more budget for public services like kindergarten for school, to make sure that maybe like water also. For example, you are live in New York or in the big cities, you don't have time, you don't have to spend time to check waters, catch waters. But women in the mountainous area like Asia or even in Africa, sometimes they have to spend like 2 hours per day from our research to catch waters. So how the government have to spend money on that to make sure that gender equality. That is like something from the whole pictures from Asia. So any question can come later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tui. And next to her is Francesca Rhodes. She's the gender policy advisor at Oxfam UK, and I'll also give her the floor to share with us her perspectives.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of this really rich conversation. So I'm going to talk about two pieces of research that our civil society partners and Oxfam country teams have done in Kenya and in Vietnam. So I hope I do their work justice by sharing it here today. I'm also going to talk briefly about a new publication we have, which is called A Short Guide to Taxing for Gender Equality, which is published with the Women's Budget Group, which is hopefully a useful tool to keep having these conversations and looking further into these issues. So firstly, I wanted to talk about the research conducted in Vietnam on the gendered impact of a proposed rise in VAT, so related to what my colleague was just mentioning. So in August 2017, the government of Vietnam announced a number of tax reforms, including a proposal to increase the rate of VAT from 10% to 12%. So the Vietnam Tax Justice Alliance worked in partnership with a women's rights organisation called CPU, and they wanted to assess what the gendered impact of this proposed VAT rise would be. And the research wanted to look both at the impact on households and also on the economy as a whole from a gender perspective. They used the Vietnam Household Living Survey and also combined that with a literature review to be able to form some questions to look at the gender impact of this VAT proposed rise. So firstly, they looked at the different impact on male and female-headed households. Secondly, they looked at what the impact would be on low-income groups, and this was important because we know that women are more likely to be overrepresented in low-income groups. And thirdly, they looked at the impact on people with lower educational and qualifications and skills, as again we knew that women were more likely to be represented in this group. And the research found that this 2% increase in VAT would result in 240,000 near poor households being pushed into poverty because of the increase in their kind of daily costs. They found that particularly families with larger numbers of children, elderly people over 80, and female workers would be the most affected. They also found that households with lower educational qualifications and people in low-skilled occupations would see higher impacts of this VAT rise. So the research showed overall, and it's due to existing inequalities between women and men in education, in the way women are segregated into lower skilled work, in their access to secure incomes, in them being in more precarious situations because of gender inequality. They were more likely to be affected by this proposed VAT rise. I think it's really important to understand as well the wider context, which my colleague from ActionAid was talking about. This VAT proposed rise was proposed due to a gap in the government revenue, partly caused by the impact of free trade agreements. And we know that free trade agreements are part of a wider kind of macroeconomic model, which we know really benefits people who are already very well off. Free trade agreements are very good for multinational companies, we know, but they do end up in a a lowering of government revenue through the lowering of tariffs and barriers. And those gaps are often filled through these regressive tax policies, such as increasing VAT, which has an impact on women in poverty. So we need to think about the links between these specific policies, but the wider macroeconomic model and how it is gendered. And the second piece of research I wanted to talk about briefly was trying to understand how women informal traders based in Nairobi were experiencing tax policy. And this was part of efforts by Oxfam in Kenya and our partners to really support citizens to have awareness of their rights as taxpayers, including the right to hold governments to account on fair taxation and to public services that tax people pay should be paid for and should be provided. So this research was qualitative, as well as trying to understand the quantitative impacts. And the research found that many women informal traders were not aware of the taxes that they should be paying, and they weren't aware also of how those taxes were or weren't being spent on public services. So this had two particular implications. So firstly, the women were more vulnerable to exploitation and harassment from city officials, because they didn't know which taxes they should be paying, and then therefore city officials could tell them that there were certain taxes, and they could be exploited in that way. And secondly, they didn't know how to hold their governments or their officials to account for the public services and the social protection that they should be receiving as taxpayers. So this example, I think, really speaks to the need to bring citizens and to bring women into the conversation to understand how tax policy affects them, and to sort of think of women as rights holders in terms of the tax that they pay. And lastly, I just wanted to mention this new publication we have, the Short Guide to Taxing for Gender Equality. There's some copies outside. So it's really a guide aimed at people who want to do further work and further research to understand the gendered impacts of different types of tax policy. So it takes you through the different types of questions that you can ask, and the different types of research and data that is available. And it also comes with some of the case studies, two of which I've talked about today. And it starts with saying tax policies that are not gender transformative are not just. So I think I'll just finish there.
Thank you, Francesca, for the very insightful presentation. And I hope we are all on the same page, despite the technical issues we are having with the microphone and having to really speak out. I hope you're really following the conversation. And if you have any question or comments, please note them down. We'll have a session for us to interact at the end. So next is Vanessa. Vanessa is a research associate at the International Center for Tax and Development. So,
great, thank you so much. So as we discuss the possibilities of tax policy to reinforce or to actually address gender inequities, I want to make the case for expanding the lens of our analysis to include informal systems of taxation and local public finance, in addition to the more traditional forms of tax that we normally talk about. So, the foundations of research in this area have largely focused on high-income countries. So it's perhaps unsurprising that policy and advocacy work in this area has tended to think about tax and gender through a narrow lens, which has predominantly focused on identifying biases in formal tax policy and the associated systems of filing and exemptions. But I argue that this is problematic as it leads us to overlook the ways in which individuals actually interact with tax systems in low-income countries. So despite some evidence of structural biases in formal tax systems, in practice, the research shows that the impact of these biases is often quite limited because very few people, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, actually pay direct taxes to the central government. So for example, in the case study that I'm looking at today in Sierra Leone, central government taxes on individuals represent less than 2% of GDP. In reality, user fees are often much more important to financing local public goods and services, while at the same time, while formal taxation is often limited, citizens often contribute substantial amounts outside of the formal tax system to the construction and maintenance of local public goods and services, through what is known as informal taxation. And informal taxation, these are payments that are made to state or non-state actors. It may be in cash, in kind, or through labor. They're enforced outside of the formal legal system, but they're often necessary to access basic services. And they can be an important way, important means of filling gaps that have been left by the state or by complementing a weak state service provision. So because of their importance to financing local public goods, and local public goods that would otherwise be financed by formal tax systems, not including user fees and informal taxes in analyses of gender and tax in low-income countries will leave us with an incomplete understanding of gender inequities, because these inequities will be embedded in both formal and informal structures and institutions. So I use this broader lens of analysis in my research to explore gender inequities in the case of Sierra Leone. I rely on 2 household surveys that capture tax incidences and burdens at the household level, as well as over 8 months of qualitative data collection, including extensive interviews and focus group discussions. So I'm going to share 3 key findings from this research. So first, to reiterate, I find that formal taxes have a very small impact on the majority of citizens. Central government taxes are paid by only 4% of citizens, and local government revenues amount to only about $1 per capita. And that's despite an extensive decentralization program in Sierra Leone that followed the Civil War. By contrast, user fees are the most widely paid levies by citizens, by taxpayers, and they make up the largest payment type as a proportion of income. And at the same time, informal taxes and user fees are significant. They make up almost 1/3 of all the payments that households make, with almost 70% of households reporting having paid at least one informal tax in order to access a public good or service in the previous year. So this data really bolsters the point that in order to understand the gendered effects of systems of public finance and service delivery, we need to also consider the gendered impacts of user fees and informal taxes and user fees. Second, I find that female-headed households pay fewer formal taxes and user fees than male-headed households. And this is unsurprising for some of the reasons that we've already begun discussing today. So women tend to have lower incomes, so they may be more likely to fall under formal tax thresholds. And at the same time, tax payment is often shaped by gendered interaction between states and citizens. And in Sierra Leone, this has evolved out of colonial structures that themselves were gendered. So for example, at the local level in Sierra Leone, women were not considered eligible taxpayers until the post-war period, until after 2004. So this has left lingering gendered sentiments about women's duty to pay taxes to the government, even within households. So, but while female-headed households pay fewer formal taxes, we also see that they are more likely to pay more informal taxes to access public goods and services. And there's also abundant evidence that women play a critical role in communal forms of self-help and public service provision that involve levying informal user fees, particularly with respect to the building and management of schools, paying of community volunteer teachers, and management of local water resources. So finally, the third key finding that I want to share is that, despite no gender inequities being entrenched in policy, female-headed households pay a larger proportion of their income towards tax relative to male-headed households. And this is true across all of the most. For example, despite higher rates of land ownership amongst male-headed households, female-headed households are more likely to pay a greater proportion of their income in property tax. And this is also true for user fees and informal taxes. So because these payments are more likely to be flat, they're more likely to be regressive, and can lead to discrimination against women and girls when they're required to access basic public goods such as health, education, water, and sanitation. So just to sum up, the fact that female-headed households pay more informal taxes and pay a greater proportion of their income in both formal and informal taxes really reinforces the need to include user fees and informal taxes into analyses of of gender and tax. You know, gender inequities are embedded within social, political, and economic structures. And so understanding these inequities requires that we look at the full range of these structures, which include both formal and informal institutions. And very finally, I want to highlight just 3 implications that we may begin to think about and discuss today about these gendered impacts. So first, there may be implications with regard to gender-based differences in intra-household budgeting, money, and power. So, thinking about what the division of responsibilities of tax payments and fees within households and what implications that has. Second is the links, thinking about the links between taxation and political representation. So if women pay fewer formal taxes than men, do they miss out on channels of political representation that are often thought to come with tax payment? And finally, links to taxpayer engagement with the state more broadly. So given that tax is often seen as a key means of shaping the ties between state and society, do gender differences in payment affect how taxpayers engage with the state in broader ways? So I look forward to discussing these things with you after the break. Thank you.
Vanessa has just made a case for us to really consider expanding our analysis lens and bring in the informal aspects of taxation. So I think on that note, I'll not want to say any more. I'll let us discuss further during the interactive session. On that note, I'd like to invite Isolde to also share with us her perspectives. She's the president of the European Public Services Union. We are very grateful to have her with us and to also have her speak and share with us her perspectives. So.
Thank you very much. Yes, colleagues, I will speak a little more slowly because English is not my mother language, so I beg your pardon. As you heard, I'm president of EPSU. EPSU is the European Federation of Public Services, which is PSI's a European region representing 8 million workers in health and social care, governance, including tax, administrations, energy and water. And nearly 17% of EPSU's memberships are women. And as we heard, it is women that suffer from a tax system that hands out gifts to the rich and multinationals. Meanwhile, working class women pay a disproportionate share in the form of consumption taxes, including on basic like water, energy and sanitary products. Large numbers of women work in public services, in health and social care. It is a majority of women, and women rely more proportionately on quality public services that should help to elevate some of the double burden of care and unpaid household work on the one hand and paid employment on the other. So when pay is cut in the name of austerity, like they do in Europe, and when services are eroded, it is women who suffer, and particularly working women. That is why tax and gender is so key to our struggle as trade unions, and it is our members that suffer from the current unequal system. Tax justice and gender equality are both at the core of what EPSU does as a trade union federation. On the 8th of March, and in view of the CSW, EPSU published its reflections and demands for the CSW under a briefing with the title "Public Services Are a Double Win for Gender Equality." Now I will cut my speech a little bit because I have not so many time. If you are interested in a report from a project which EPSU did in Ghana, please give me your email address and I will send you the second part. I want you to know something new about what happens in Europe. And the the most, nearly the biggest problem we have and on which we are working is tackling tax avoidance. And perhaps you heard that, or you know that McDonald's is the second largest private sector employer in the world. And it is low-paid, undervalued work that is done disproportionately by women. And McDonald's workers suffer directly from the company's tax policies. In France, trade unions are arguing in court that the tax dodging scheme deprived them of a profit-linked bonus that workers in that country are entitled to by law. Linking the tax issue to worker struggles in the company in an example of how public and private sector workers can unite. This report they made, named Unhappy Meal, found that the fast food leader paid almost zero corporate tax in Europe. It shifted its profits derived from royalties into a minuscule company based in Luxembourg with connections to Switzerland and Delaware, benefiting from Luxembourg's generous secret tax deals with the support of taxing advising firms. And this report, Unhappy Meal, is very known in Europe. Meanwhile, this report has helped a lot in raising awareness in Europe, showing that not only the digital economy indulges in tax avoidance, it was helped increase the profile of trade unions fighting for tax justice. Most importantly, it led to McDonald's being summoned 3 times to testify in the European Parliament. And it led the European Commission to launch a probe into McDonald's in light of EU competition rules. On 19th of September in 2018, the European Commission has announced its decision on the McDonald's state aid investigation that was launched in December 2015. The EC admits that McDonald's hasn't paid any taxes in the period of the investigation, using a mix of tax rulings and a loophole in the US-Luxembourg double taxation treaty. This is not fair, but it was not illegal. And thus the global fast food leader could not be sanctioned by the EU competition authorities, not to be believed. The stated reason is that the company was not granted by Luxembourg a selective advantage. National governments, however, can act and sanction the company. The European Federation of Public Services unions, as APSU, deplores the lack of sanctions and the impunity that it represents. It sends a wrong signal to all multinational corporations across the globe that can continue not paying their fair share of tax. To make the metaverse, the decision came on the heels of announced plans by Luxembourg to reduce its corporate tax rate from 26 to 20%. Incredible. We will, however, continue pressing governments where investigations of McDonald's tax schemes are going on, as in France, Italy, and Spain. Now, another good thing, what happened following on from the LuxLeaks in 2014, EPSO supported a parliament's inquiry in the hundreds of companies that received secret tax rebates from Luxembourg authorities. A cross-party special tax committee was established, mandate of which was renewed twice. These special tax committees have helped a lot to keep the issue of tax justice on the agenda for the past 5 years. Many of the proposals on tax have been improved by progressive groups in Parliament, which has also picked up demand, called substantial increases of staff in tax division. And now, I must hurry up. Now, the Parliament adopted a resolution this is new and good, on gender equality and taxation policies in the EU. Unfortunately, it's not a binding measure. There's no obligation for member states to follow up, and the vote was supported by a small majority as well. But the resolution includes many of the proposals which are essential to the future of sustainable and progressive tax systems, such as public country-by-country reporting and a common corporate tax base, which the European Labour Movement supports concerning the rates. So it's not binding, but it will help us to continue. And to conclude, ahead of the next EU elections in a few weeks in June, we have now very detailed proposals of that resolution on tax justice by making closer links to gender equality and funding of public services, and we can ensure that our members can relate to and identify with these demands. We have a full agenda to campaign on that on national, European and global levels, and I hope we will convince governments to agree to those proposals. For the past few years, trade unions and NGOs have worked closely so that tax would become a popular political topic in Europe. We can be proud of this achievement, but much more remains to be done for governments and for us to agree to real progressive change. And we will struggle, we go ahead and struggle further together with you. Thank you so much. And I beg your pardon with my English. Oh my goodness.
Thank you, Isolde. So you've given us and illustrated really how companies are using very sophisticated tax planning methods to avoid paying taxes, and how governments are losing out, how women are losing out because of this. And so I would want to invite Yamini. Yamini, okay, she'd like to stand here on the podium because there's no space here. So Yamini is the Director of Gender, Sexuality and Identity Program at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. So Yamini.
Thank you. And before working for Amnesty International, I used to work with UN Women at their Asia Pacific office, and we did tons of work on gender budgeting across Asia Pacific region. I think well over 20-25 countries are working on gender budgeting, but actually only a handful of countries ever bothered to look at the taxation side. So in my entire stint with UN Women, I think it was East Timor, Vietnam, with a couple of countries that were really looking at the taxation side. So I wanted to compliment the co-organizers, and for Kathleen for all the work. I think really a lot more of this work is required. I wanted to, looking at the body of work that has emerged on gender and taxation, I wanted to summarize the key points that I think are the points of tension in this work on gender and taxation. I think for me, these are the two biggest challenges that we confront in the work on gender and taxation. One, and I'm articulating it as tokenism versus transformational change. So a lot of that we see the governments are doing on giving incentives to women. Is it really tokenism, or is it really transformational change? Because if we are to apply the principles of CEDAW, then we are looking at transformational change in the gender stereotypes and gender roles that the taxation system can bring about. So one is that. And the other, which is sort of related, is really micro benefits to women versus the larger tax kitty or the larger tax justice issue. And again, a lot of debates come here. I mean, in countries like India, we would argue that yes, of course, the larger kitty is increasing, but we can't make an assumption that the larger tax kitty is being used then to promote gender justice, because there can be all kinds of priorities that governments have. But actually, Kathleen's work shows, the data crunching that she's done shows that countries with higher tax GDP ratios are countries with lower gender inequality. Am I right, Kathleen? So I think these are some of the key tensions that seem to be emerging, and I wanted to give you a couple of very quick examples. In India, say for instance, and in most countries across the globe, property ownership is heavily skewed in favor of men, something that we know, and therefore tax systems can create incentives to increase women's ownership of property. So in India, we have the classic example from the state of Rajasthan, where there was a reduction in stamp duty if the property were to be registered in the name of a woman. So the state government reduced the stamp duty from 8% to 5% in case of gifts or immovable property if it is registered in the name of a sister, a daughter, a granddaughter, mother, or wife. Again, a really, really small measure, and property duties in India are actually already pretty low. But this did result in a significant increase in the number of number of properties being registered in the name of women. There's a UNIFEM study that showed that more than 2 lakh women registered their names, additional names were added in the property rights. Of course, there's a larger issue that still remains, which is it just being used as a token? I mean, do really women have control over these properties? But I think it's a good start nonetheless. And likewise, there's an example from Nepal where a tax exemption was introduced to incentivize transfer of property assets to women, and they found that women's land ownership increased 3-folds between 2001 and 2009. So such examples coming in on how tax system can be used to correct the deeply skewed property ownership patterns that we see in our country. The other example is that from personal income tax, because again, taking the example from India, historically India had a tax structure which had a lower tax bracket for women, because much of the women are in the informal sector, almost 95 to 97%, and therefore the idea was to incentivize them to move to the formal sector and also to give them some degree of equalization with men. Now this really turned out to be tokenism, because as I said, majority of the women were in the informal sector. The percentage of population that actually pays tax is just about 3%, and therefore while it might have been noble in its cause, it actually didn't make much difference, and therefore it was a move that was finally discontinued. I wanted to quickly touch on the issue of user fees that one of the previous speakers has spoken about, and much evidence coming from Africa, from Asia. In fact, the classic case that I always cite is the example from Kenya, where introduction of user fees in the sphere of health and STD services resulted in a decline in both men and women using these services. The decline was much more for women, but also once they removed the user fees, the usage levels went down to the above the user fees imposition level. So it's actually fairly elastic. And the reason why I wanted to touch on the issue of user fees is because of the topic of CSW this year. If we are talking about provision of social services, I think it's important for all of us to make a concerted voice about the fact that introduction of user fees can be gender discriminatory. And again, the same tension between tokenism and transformational change is seen in the area of special economic zones, which is coming across in many of our countries in big ways. There was a study that was done by Murayama and Yokoto in 2008, which argued that globally about 37% of employment generated through special economic zones actually go to women, and largely to garment production. And therefore, a case could be made that tax breaks which are actually given to special economic zones can actually increase women's labor force participation rates. However, we need to juxtapose it with the fact that SEZs do bring about huge dilution in labor law standards, work conditions are highly exploitative, wages are highly exploitative, and so on and so forth. Again, the tension between tokenism versus transformational change, and I think this is something that we'll need to grapple with. I want to touch on the last issue now, which is something that many countries across the globe are grappling with, which is the austerity measures. UK, large parts of Europe, large parts of Asia. In fact, I was looking at the figures, well over 50 countries across the globe are dealing with austerity measures. So I wanted to share with you this latest study that we did as Amnesty International on the impact of austerity measures in Spain. And we found that following the economic crisis of 2008, there was significant reduction in spending, in healthcare spending, which resulted in deterioration in accessibility, affordability, quality of care, and so on and so forth. We also argued that it had a particular disproportionate impact on people with lower income, chronic health conditions, disability. So it was particularly disadvantageous to the sections of population that we consider as marginalized or vulnerable. Now, so our research showed that it has resulted in an increase in financial burden of healthcare on common people. It has resulted in delays in access to healthcare. It has resulted in reduced time with health workers, and the quality of care, all of that has dipped down. But what really helped us nail it is the argument that the government had not exhausted all alternatives. So on the financial side, on the tax side, the fact that the government had not exhausted all tax mobilization arguments helped us call it like a human rights violation. And I think that part is extremely important. Now, human rights bodies, as you know, have developed guidelines for how austerity measures needs to be developed and implemented to be consistent with CSR obligations. And the criteria is actually fairly rigorous and compelling. It says that you have to show that there is a compelling state interest. You have to show there is necessity in these measures. You have to show that there is reasonableness. You have to show that these measures are temporary. You have to show that there is proportionality of the austerity measures and the exhaustion of alternative and less restrictive measures, and that it's non-discriminatory. So if you look at what was happening in Spain on the taxation side at that time, and Special Rapporteur has also spoken about it, they did increase the VAT, which is not good news from a gender perspective. They did increase top income tax rates, which is fine, but at the same time, the corporate tax rates actually came down. And actually, if you look at the composition of tax revenue of Spain over the years, personal income tax was going up, but corporate income tax was coming down, and VAT was actually going up. I'm just finding out. So, just to say that arguments like this helped us call for the fact that actually the government had not exhausted all revenue options. It hadn't made use of the maximum available resource paradigm. And just want to end with this last point, which is that in India, again, the GST has been introduced, and I was asking colleagues that has anybody done a study of how GST has impacted on women? And somebody told me, yeah, sanitary pads, we know. So I'm like, yeah, sanitary pads are important, but so that's what I was trying to say, this essentialism versus instrumentalism of women, I think is a challenge that we deal with. I was reading a book which said the biggest challenge for women's rights is essentialism versus instrumentalism, and I think that's precisely the challenge even in gender and tax area. Thank you.
I've realized we are running out of time, and so I'd want Kathleen to sort of share with us her perspectives, but also to kind of summarize the discussion points that we've had from the rest of the speakers. So Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know how well I'll be able to summarize, but I will be happy to hit on what I think are the crucial points that I'm here to talk about. The first is that there is clearly a big recognition of how damaging consumption taxes, predominantly the VAT, GST type of tax, may be, but the proliferation of types of consumption taxes continues to grow as more and more types of events become taxable through consumption type taxes. And this is a serious problem because now the world is so heavily dependent on these very expansive value-added taxes that in fact it has become a threat to people's ability to even meet the basic necessities of living. So what I want to focus on is the fact that methodologically we need to really become much more aggressive in the way we approach these issues. Usually the harm done by VAT is measured as a percentage of monies that are expended, usually on a household basis. Usually the closest we can get to gender impact is to look at who is the head of the household, but there's also robust literature demonstrating that in fact a female-headed household does not necessarily depend in significantly different ways for income on the labor power or income of that head of the household. It may or it may not. It's not the driving factor. A second, more challenging approach to identify the impact of the VAT is to look at how VAT takes up income that comes into the house, not just expenditure, because that's actually the measure of ability to pay, whether there is income present. But that's very difficult to get at because it is difficult to individualize everyone. However, I managed to, through a couple of unique projects, get my hands on individual consumption information in household surveys for individuals, both of women and of men, and also to find out exactly how much VAT was collected with respect to those individuals. And shockingly, I found, and this is not an unusual situation, it was a country with very high rates of low incomes, had heavily relied upon extractives for much of its revenue, discovered that they were drying up, dashed around looking for things to do. The World Bank came to the rescue. Here's the VAT plan. When I got my hands on this data, I discovered that the monthly income needed to pay for the basic necessities of living were $43.20. The government said, don't worry about the VAT, there are so many exemptions. So I calculated using the household data to see exactly what was exempt and what wasn't, and that left $1.98 on average that would not be covered. And when you start looking at the fact that 67% of female individual incomes were between zero and at top in the sixth decile, $40 per month, that meant that something like 67% of all women were going to lose at least $2 of their basic necessities of living every month. And the effect was not that different for men. 63% of men also live with that degree of poverty. So this is causing active harm. I then had the opportunity to look at virtually identical data in a virtually identical scenario, very rich jurisdiction that had been over-reliant on extractive industries and had decided that the way to go was the VAT. Did the same kind of analysis, showed the exact same upside-down effect. Both countries could have raised what they were looking for with the VAT in the low-income country by just passing one more tax rate in the personal income tax schedule, and it would have only affected the two richest deciles. In the high-income jurisdiction, it would have drawn on increased PIT to make up the same revenue from individuals in the top 4 income deciles. So it is incredibly upside down, this reliance on the value-added tax. In addition, the low-income country had one of the highest rates of nutritional stunting and wasting found anywhere in the globe at the time. And even the high-income jurisdiction wasn't really doing all that well because of the great disparities in income. So bottom line, the VAT, as it has come to represent more than twice as much of the revenue produced by any other tax system, has become something that low, medium-low, and medium-high income countries cannot live without, and they are at the mercy of the corporate and wealth holding sector in driving down personal income and corporate income tax rates, which are the ones that will offer them any remedy for this. So I would say that this is actually a situation that is unacceptable, creates constant damage to individuals. And I would just like to point out that both the Columbia Constitutional Review Court in 2002 and the European Court of Human Rights in 2003 both ruled explicitly that reliance on the VAT in situations in which anyone would have to pay any VAT on any of the basic necessities of life violates the human right to life. Because without the necessities of life, it is not possible to continue living. It's just that simple. So that's my main point. The only other point that I would like to make is that yesterday, the committee, the CDAW committee in Geneva, adopted a set of concluding observations relating to the UK and all of its overseas territories and all of its crown dependencies, chewing them out to the same extent that Switzerland got chewed out with respect to tax avoidance services. And so that has now been served on the UK. And if people have any questions about that, we can talk about it later. Thank you.
I'd like to open it up if there are any questions for the panel or comments in addition to what they have shared. So we have one. Can we have maybe three? 1, 2? Okay, we'll have the two first.
Thank you very much. Irene Obonji, I used to be with Action Aid International on the international board, but currently, and also was with the Mbeki panel, but currently I'm part of the task force for Pan-African Lawyers Union on illicit financial flows. I've just been appointed as a commissioner with ICRIT. This is a very important discussion. I'll try to be fast. I usually speak a lot. I think the critical question I had for everybody and for all of us is quite often we know what needs to be done. There are a lot of reports, there are a lot of studies, both of governments and civil society. Why isn't action being taken sufficiently? So we need to get to the heart of the why no steps are actually being taken. And for me, I think that is very much about the politics surrounding choices around tax and the different power between the 1% and the rest. So for us as women women from the women's movement, there are some lessons we need to learn. The first is that while a lot of these measures, austerity measures by the way started in Africa, structural adjustment programs, a lot of these measures are called different things depending on where it's happening. We need to get beyond that which creates division in terms of language and perception and begin to understand where our interests are, common interests are. There's a need to build alliances in countries, in regions, and across countries, because this is actually a global problem. You have the 1% who have gamed the system, first in the global south, and are now increasingly doing it in the global north. So we need to begin to understand where our common interests are. That's one. Unpack the political economy of this issue and build alliances across the globe. The other thing is the lack of often interest, but also knowledge in much of the women's movement and generally human rights movement, civil society and so on, around issues of economics, tax particularly. So how do we demystify these issues so that people can make the direct link between their lives and what is happening in this? It's a very technical issue as well as a very political issue. So we need to find language that connects it very directly to people's lives. And I personally believe, and this was an issue I pushed in the Becky process, until you have, I used to call them the losers, until somebody told me that's really bad language. But until you have those who are losing from the status quo, invested in the issue, working together and mobilized, we will not get a solution. Because we have that nexus in all our countries. We see it in this country, I'm currently based here. We see it across the board, the nexus between politicians and the private sector around profit. There is a direct interest. So we have to get beyond that and build that alliance of those who are losing from the current status quo. So that mobilization, I think, is a big part of what you need to do, what we all need to do. And so we must demystify this, create the explicit links. And I think what you raised, Vanessa, is very important, that conceptually, there is a lot of work to be done. So again, going beyond what's happening in formal systems and understanding, formal and understanding what's happening in the formal systems as well is part of demystifying and creating those links. And finally, I love the fact that you have women in public service, in trade unions, in civil society, in NGOs. That's the kind of alliance that we have to do to bring on board all these different categories. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for that decisive comment. I wanted to hear her go on and on, you know? So let's have the next.
I'm Jackie Alwesa. Thank you for your presentation. And I want to know, we know that social protection is a really action for the women rights. Then we talk about taxes in Africa and taxes in Europe, in USA and in Europe. In Africa, they take the taxes directly, right? I want to know, in your opinion, what method is better for the social protection for women, in your opinion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Jane Chaya Iram and I work with Oxfam. I just wanted to speak about the intersectionality of issues and speak specifically to an issue that Francesca raised about trade policy, which I think is very important in driving the current move that we're seeing towards more consumption taxes, because we are entering into more and more free trade agreements, some of which result into zero-rated taxes, and governments find themselves in this race to the bottom and having to look for alternatives in terms of trying to raise resources to finance public expenditure. And that is why we're seeing this increase in consumption taxes. So So I think it's important that we interrogate trade policy, and as we approach these issues of discussing taxation and consumption taxes, we need to start to link up with those organizations that are involved in trade policy advocacy, so that we speak to each other and we deliver the same message.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Because we are running out of time. Are you kind enough to run to the back? Anyone else? I'll take 2 more, and that will be it. Okay, 3. So, lady at the back, the lady with the scarf, and Tove, and then we'll have closing remarks from the whole panel, because we only have 8 minutes to go. So, the lady at the back?
From Guyana Trade Union, Guyana Public Service Trade Union. My question is that in Guyana, our taxation, VAT, value-added tax, is 14%. And I think it's very high. And it affects public servants who are small-scale workers a great lot. Because everything that in Guyana, every single thing is value-added tax. And because of that, you find public servants whose salaries are very small are feeling the burden. And we really think something needs to be done about Guyana value-added taxes. It should be lower, that we can afford to get certain things in Guyana.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Irene from Swaziland. Well, my comment is on transparency issues. Our governments are still non-transparent in terms of how do they utilize the taxes, how much do they mobilize, and how do they utilize those spaces. For instance, in my country, we're asking the VAT, it's 15%. Where does it go? And we're actually putting alternatives. Where can it be used? Why doesn't it be used to fund tertiary students or whatever? So the transparency issue is how we make sure that as trade unionists, we kind of challenge them to make sure that it's transparent and we know how much is directed to public services. Thank you.
Right.
Tove writing from Eurodad. I think, first of all, thanks to an amazing panel. Super interesting, and I share the optimism in the diversity of this discussion and the many partners coming together. I also love that we're at the point of talking about mobilization and standing together. It's clear that we're fighting the battles at the national level, but we're also part of a global development. There are international forces pushing this. And what I hope as we go forward is that we can also talk about mobilizing against what? Where do these rules come from? Where is it these decisions are made? Where are we marching to? And I think as part of that discussion, one of the things that before I worked on other issues coming to tax, one of the things I've noticed is that the decision-making processes on tax are some of the most opaque, closed, exclusive clubs that you can see. It's both IMF, World Bank, G20, and OECD. And the problem we have is that the institutions that have committed to gender equality have not been allowed to talk about money. And tax is also one of the issues where the conversation stops at global goals. But when it comes to actually talking about the drivers of gender inequality, the conversation's being shut down at the United Nations, and they're actually sitting in Paris and other places and talking about these things, and we are not welcome in those buildings. So it's just to put that one on the table.
Thanks, Tove. So to our panel, if you can respond to some of the questions raised and comments, and your closing remarks as well, because we are out of time. I'm sorry. So
just on the first question, which is why aren't we being able to get any success, and is it totally political? I mean, look at the way elections are funded. It's all about crony capitalism. They fund the elections, and therefore the people who we elect go and create policies that work for them. In fact, there was a campaign in India which said, जिस किसी को वोट दो साथ में 10 रुपए का नोट दो, which would mean when you vote for anybody, give like 1 pence or whatever, then at least they listen to us. So totally with you on the crony capitalism. I think we haven't even organized women as a voting bloc. So forget about women and taxation being at the heart of issues. So we clearly have the fundamental feminist principles of organizing, mobilizing is something that will come back to haunt us over and over again. I think there's really no getting away from that. But of course, the responsibility on people who do such work is to demystify this material and feed it into the people's movement, which again is important. On intersectionality, I don't think it's just good. I think it's an absolute must. In India, we try to do some work on gender budgeting for Dalit women, gender budgeting for tribal women. So not just stopping at women as a category, but any such work data is a huge challenge. I think there's still a lot more that we can do. And just the last point on transparency, totally. I was here a couple of months ago for a meeting at the UN building in which there were heads of agencies and some ministries of finance and some of us people from outside, and they were saying, our money, and we were like, no, it's not your money, it's people's money. So you have to tell people how you've got the money and how you're spending that money. So driving home the point over and over again that it is people's money, I think these are fundamental messages that we have to keep giving again and again.
Yeah, just I want to echo all the comments and to remind us that here we are talking about power relations. So this is what we have to build. Power to claim that this is our money and that we have to decide who pays and what it is used for.
Actually, for my opinion, that we have Global Tech Alliance that is already, and we also have the TAGJA in the Asia already. We had a network, but however, we need to work more on the research and substance, how to bring it together. That's the thing. Actually, Irene also answered the question, we have the network. And the other question related to the social protection for women, I think that from government, we need to review all the social protection policy first, before we bring it to the multinational company when we sign the free trade agreement. And I think that from the free trade agreement, we have to find out how we can have one chapter on gender equalities and how much budget the government should allocate or companies should allocate for gender equalities in their budgets when they have the corporate responsibility funds. Thank you.
A very important point you raised about the Global Alliance that's bringing together these different networks across Africa, Asia, Europe, North America, Latin America, plus other allies, international organizations and others, organizing at the national level, regional level, and international level. So we really need to work on that.
Yeah, no, I can completely agree. I think this point around movement building and building alliances is really important with the bringing in the other parts of the women's movement as well and economic justice movements and making those links between trade policy, tax policy. It's all part of the same kind of system of unequal power and the same kind of economic model, which is resulting in these impacts on real people's lives. So yeah, I absolutely agree. Those are the key ways forward.
So again, yes, I will agree. It's really wonderful to have everyone in this room and to start this discussion. You know, in order to address, you know, the political economy of taxation, you know, I would like to reiterate the point that I think we first need to understand, you know, how women are actually affected and how they're actually engaging with tax systems. So while there has been a lot of research or, you know, a growing body of research about gender and tax in formal tax systems, I think that there's still a lot of opportunity and a lack of knowledge about how women are actually affected through informal institutions and how those informal institutions interact with the formal ones. So I think that there's still a lot of work to be done, but there's a lot of opportunity for both policy and advocacy in this area.
Well, I think it's the right way to, as you said, to build alliances, national, international and global alliances, and to make a voice for our rights. I guess we are good, and we have so many good women in very important functions, but we can be better, and we can go on, and this must be our challenge. Yesterday I heard a slogan which really touched me, was said by a colleague from ATF, and she said our actual slogan is we care, we fight, we show up, and we vote. And this is a language, I will take it with me to Europe, because this is a language which every people in the parliaments understand very good. We would. So, and we have elections in a few days, so this is really, really good.
Okay, and I'll focus on the importance of We Fight, because the two examples that I gave you were situations in which it was possible under the circumstances to confront the governments in question directly and with a lot of civil society support with what the figures that were being produced would look like to ordinary people. And neither government has moved forward with their changes. They have instead gone in the direction, to the extent that they've done anything, to increase their personal income tax rates. So fighting with the details of the information on the ground, beginning, as Vanessa has said, with the informal practices and going through every single type of tax, that is the ammunition. That and women's sense of injustice as it has compounded through the decades of these abuses.
Right. So I think they deserve a round of applause. We have come to the tail end of this session. I want to thank you very much for being part of it and for making it very interactive and quite lively. So there's been a sheet that has been going round by Ella. So I hope you've written your name and your organization and your email and other details. So in terms of building alliances also, I wanted to also mention that within the Global Alliance, we have the Tax and Gender Working Group. So this working group brings together different organizations, academia, media, together to work on issues, tax that affect women. So it's a space that I would also like to invite you to be a part of so that we can continue this conversation on taxing for gender equality. So without much, I'd like to.
Are we taking this conversation to what is happening behind the closed door in the policy documents which is being developed by all the governments?
Yes.
Are we doing that?
Yes.
We are there.
Are you?
We are represented well there.